Welcome to the Brussels School of International Studies book launch. And this evening, we will be looking at Afghanistan Under Siege, the Afghan Body. So we've just got to welcome various people coming in. The Afghan Body and the Postcolonial Border by Bojan Savić. And we're just welcoming Gerald Toll, who's just arrived in. But my name is Jeremy Corrett. I am the Dean for Europe and Professor of Philosophy, Religion and Culture at the University of Kent. It's great to see so many of you here. And tonight, I'm very pleased to welcome the author of our book, Bojan Savić, who is lecturer in international relations at the Brussels School of International Studies at the University of Kent. He is a researcher on critical geographies, post-colonial studies, critical security studies, and international development. Great to have you here, Bojan. And to discuss the book this evening, we have two esteemed scholars in this area. That's Maximilian Drafal, from the University of Suffolk. He's an historian of empire, a specialist in international history and modern Afghanistan. And his recent book, Afghanistan and the Coloniality of Diplomacy in 2009, argued that decolonization was a transformation for ensuring the colonial afterlife. Welcome to you, Maximilian. Can you hear me?
I can hear you well. Good evening.
Good to have you here. And the other panelist for this evening is Gerald Toll, and he is Professor of Government and International Affairs at Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University's National Capital Region campus in Arlington, Virginia. He is the author of Near Abroad, Putin, the West, and the Contest over the Ukraine and the Caucasus in 2017. Welcome, Gerard. Can you hear us?
Indeed, I can.
Right. Welcome to you all. It's great to be able to discuss this book, which is an extraordinary examination of the context of Afghanistan using fieldwork and theory, and in challenging the security governance structure within Afghanistan by using different techniques to subvert the dominant discourses. I wonder whether I can start with you, Bojan, just to give us a sense of how you came to explore this area of Afghanistan and what you see as the critical contribution of your work.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Thank you, Maximilian and Jared, for joining the panel, and thank you everyone who is in the audience. The way I arrived at this topic was by sort of taking stock of what I found out during my PhD research when I was researching NATO's post-Cold War transformation. And I realized that a lot of the, or most of the mainstream literature on Afghanistan, post-2001 Afghanistan, academic, policy literature, journalistic texts, they were consumed by discussing sort of very narrow metrics of what they saw as failure or success of state building and reconstruction and security in Afghanistan. They were also to a large extent consumed with questions of burden sharing within NATO, within the EU, within UN institutions, burden sharing in the sense of who's contributing more to stabilizing Afghanistan, who's contributing less, and who should be doing more, right? And questions of just how well institutions are working within themselves, right? So within NATO, within the UN. And the bulk of these texts seem completely uninterested in the everyday experience of life of ordinary Afghans, people who every day need to decide: is it safe enough to go to work? Where do they get to work? Will they lose their home? Can they go to pray? And so, in trying to reverse that focus, I started seeing how, in fact, global security institutions have murdered Afghans, have constrained their quote unquote free movement, have constricted them to the country of Afghanistan and constrained where and how they can move from within the country. And they've done this in the name of not so much of US national security in particular, or the security of EU member states, but actually, when you unpack what they have attempted and done in Afghanistan, you see that a lot of this was predicated on this very vague idea of global stability and global security. And so I unpacked that idea and I found that it actually has no obvious or particular content or meaning to it, right? I found that when you unpack geostrategic documents, strategic concepts, national security strategies, from the US to the UK, France, NATO security concepts, you don't actually find any tangible sense of, well, how does stability look like in Afghanistan? And moreover, I kept pushing this puzzle, and I found that the development and security strategies that have been attempted by the quote-unquote world and global governance institutions in Afghanistan didn't make the place safer, but also didn't really protect the quote-unquote world from Afghanistan, right? And since none of this added up, and since I thought that there was a representational gap, right? And so much focus being put on how much money was spent on Afghanistan, what did we get in return? And virtually no attention paid to ordinary people who are the fabric of society, I decided to abandon the skewed focus and really try to travel to the country and maybe talk to people and start to see how they have felt this amount of global attention and care that has been directed at them. And in doing so, I've decided to focus on a region and city in the west of the country, Herat, because the city has received an extraordinary amount of global attention, just in terms of dollars that have been spent and invested for all sorts of development interventions, aid, good governance measures, anti-corruption, rule of law measures, fostering civil society, fostering free media. And yet people have remained, their lives have remained fairly unstable, right? And talking to them, I realized, but wait, they're undergoing all sorts of security risks on a daily basis, right? From being murdered during night raids or by the insurgency or drones, to not having access to capital, to not having jobs, right? Or losing jobs because they were accused of being somehow connected to the insurgency. What I thought was a huge volatility in their everyday lives, and how none of this was translated into strategies for Afghanistan. And so I wanted to talk to people who have been described as dangerous for themselves, as for the world and for the world. What makes them so dangerous? I wanted to talk to people who at the same time have been described as more stable and more developed than the rest of Afghanistan. And I wanted to understand, how does this place work, right? If global institutions describe them as both unstable, in need of stability, and also most prosperous, right? None of this added up. So I wanted to unpack all these questions that I've been trying to sort of summarize now and see how everyday people have lived in the midst of global insecurity or security.
Thank you, Bojan. And I think that what's fascinating about your study is the way that you've included very detailed narrative of those everyday, ordinary experiences. Did you set out with that fieldwork focus?
No, not really. Coming from my doctoral research, I was interested in what makes NATO's and other global institutions' protracted presence in Afghanistan possible. How do they justify staying in the country for so long, where the metrics of security don't seem to correspond with the strategies that NATO and the US have applied in the country, right? Troop surges and troop withdrawals, surges in aid money, and then pulling out of aid money have not corresponded with desirable and undesirable effects. In fact, they were largely uncorrelated. Right? Troops go up, but insecurity often and mortality rates, numbers of casualties, they go up as well, right? Troops pull out, sometimes the situation gets more stable on the ground. And so because this didn't add up, I first wanted to see, what makes it possible for the globe to be so present in Afghanistan, regardless of outcomes. But then, once I arrived in the country, I realized that both my initial scholarly interest and the way that global academia, policy analysts and institutions talk about Afghanistan really disregards ordinary people. And then I was put to test, to be honest. Day one of my field work. Well, you're either going to follow in the suit of this type of academia, or you're going to try and do something else. And to be perfectly honest, I had to reinvent field work on the go while sort of trying to get to talk to people in Kabul, in Herat. I had to reinvent what the point was, because what I saw was a lot of ordinary people taking advantage of NATO funding, US funding, UN funding, the money that came in through bilateral donors and institutions such as USAID, taking advantage of it, using it in ways that were purportedly corrupt or inappropriate. Yet this was the only way for them to survive, to really maximize their life chances, right? So what they were doing on the ground in their everyday lives was helping them, yet that was being condemned as undermining Afghan security. So the more I push this focus on everyday people, the more discrepancies I found between what they needed and what they were told they needed.
Thank you, Bojan. I wonder if I could move to Maximilian, and obviously your own analysis of Afghanistan under colonialism is key to how you're approaching Bojan's work. How did you see this critical analysis fitting into the longer history of Afghanistan in terms of your own work of that afterlife of the colonial?
Well, thanks very much. First of all, let me take a moment to say what a wonderful achievement this is. So congratulations, Bojan, and thank you again for inviting me. For me, 3 points really stand out when I read this book. I'm a historian, and my field is the early 20th century, a period that is usually called the interwar period, between the First and the Second World War. So that is my approach to the subject. But obviously, that period is an important transformative period in the way we conceive of international relations, in the way the world of the 20th century was structured, how power was distributed, often again in very familiar asymmetrical terms. So this is my approach to Bojan's book, which I enjoyed reading a lot. And if I may just take a few moments here to point out 3 points, 3 larger points that stand out for me here, and why I think this book really contributes to our understanding of Afghanistan in the long term, or how the past, if you want, influences how we think about Afghanistan in the present. And what Bojan already also said about how we turn Afghanistan into legible categories, how we actually create knowledge about Afghanistan that makes it intelligible for, well, those who hold power and who are interested in the country, especially so since 2001. The first point I would point out is that there has been a lot of interest in the Afghan body, and there's a vast literature on the Afghan body. But what is so unusual about this book is it really focuses on different kinds of bodies, if you want. Especially the counterinsurgency literature after 2001 has given us, and which has also influenced colonial history and historiography on that subject, is it's given us a big library on bodies that are warlike Pashtuns, that are Islamic terrorists, and in fact, that are often also oppressed women. So those are the bodies that we know a lot about. And what Bojan has done here, and why I think he really contributes to the scholarship, is that here we see different kinds of bodies. Here we see ordinary Afghans, as he calls them. We see practitioners of Shia Islam. They're Farsi speaking, and they are Tajiks as well. So our gaze, if you want, in inverted commas, obviously shifts away, and really adds to the scholarship here. In a way, what this book does, it does different things to how we think about Afghan bodies, and makes us reconsider and broaden our understanding of Afghan bodies in more broadly. And how it contributes to that thinking about bodily history, well, it in a way shows us how oppressed bodies are empowered and the means that they find to be empowered and speak up against power holders. So that's, in a way, point number one. Point number two, for me, is that, in a way, it adds a very different imagination of Afghanistan. This is not the normal way that we imagine Afghanistan. And again, the reference point is what Bojan said coming into this. It is not this kind of counterinsurgency prose that we see. The Afghanistan we find out here about the book is one that is actually a place of peaceful resistance, almost of civil disobedience. It resists, not in the ways that we are often told that Afghans resist, which is through violence. So in that sense, it really succeeds in pushing back on the conventional ways, if you want, of thinking about resistance in Afghan history. And if I may, the last point for me is, and how it fits into that larger historiography, into that larger study, what intrigued me is the notion of the post-colonial border. There are many borders in this book. There are disciplinary borders, and these borders obviously run through the scholarship on Afghanistan, scholarship that has been created in various disciplines of geography, history, IR, anthropology, and so on. We see quite a few borders, and the fact that we do see quite a few borders is in itself an embodiment of that knowledge and how that knowledge about Afghanistan was constructed. And in speaking as a historian, what I found really intriguing about the book, and especially its the history of the border, is that there's an episode, a historical episode of 1871, when Arthur Goldsmith was sent to arbitrate the Perso-Afghan border. And this happened at a time when Afghanistan and Persia were, yes, constructed as buffer states, but they weren't quite on the receiving end of imperial powers delineating Persia's or Afghanistan's border quite yet. And for me, there is a very interesting parallel of this book between how the post-colonial border is in a way reimagined and turned into a space, a liminal space that is also transgressed, to that original historical episode of 1871, when exactly Afghanistan was made as a geopolitical entity by the imperial powers of the day, Great Britain and Imperial Russia. So I suppose those 3 points about how it treats bodies, how it thinks about a different kind of imagination of Afghanistan, and how it looks at the post-colonial border, I think in that ways it really informs and also pushes back on a lot of body of scholarship and makes a contribution to how we, in a way, can only begin to start decolonizing that kind of knowledge.
Yeah, thank you, Maximilian. Bojan, what Maximilian is drawing out is these different borders. And I'm very, very struck when you're at the border, the checkpoint, and different people are gathering, and there's this sort of conversation about bodies at the border, and the way that the kind of resistances are set up at the border by framing bodies according to their size, shape, and if like the resistance in the discourse. So you get a border and a body border, and types of body borders on the border. Can you unwrap some of the intensity of your analysis there?
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you so much, Maximilian, for your very kind comments and your excellent questions as well. Yeah, that was so the episode you're bringing up, Jeremy, is from the Afghan-Iranian border at this checkpoint called Islam Kala, which is about 80 miles, 125 or so kilometers from Herat, right, within the Herat province. And there you have a lot of ordinary people who are trying to get into Iran, who are being kicked out of or repatriated from Iran, and so who congregate around the border in the cafes, around the buses, around their cars, while they're waiting. It's not always even clear to me or to a lot of observers what they were exactly waiting for, but there's also a lot of social life that just goes on, socialization. There are also street vendors. It's a very lively sort of space. And one way that I saw that global institutions and the cooperative Afghan government, as it's often being called and mocked, the way they're challenged, the way they're pushed back against is through mockery, right? Is through sort of surreptitious dialogue, right? So laughing at security guards for their sort of physical appearance, for how they walk, how they talk, how they try to perform this sort of scary sovereignty and authority. And then challenging them through sometimes literally child play, right? How children steal money from them, how they're made fun of, because a lot of these people know each other also. Some of the border guards and people who congregate at the border, they come from, you know, same town, same village, right? And it is at this place where you see, where I saw just how important is the ability to touch, render tangible global institutions and normalize them, counter-normalize them in ways that ordinary people can't, right? And so through mockery, through small-scale theft, through sabotage, right? Through gossip, what you see is people trying to sort of come to terms with this otherwise dangerous place where there have been suicide attacks, place where the border police and the Afghan army are authorized to shoot and ask no questions, and have done so. And so you see everyday people making this otherwise very oppressive place into something they can live with, something they can even profit from, right? By selling, I don't know, soda, or opening up a restaurant, or operating a smuggling business, all sorts of things that come to life really at the border. And that was that showing their ability to renegotiate what imposition, what constriction, what limitation means was very important for me, because I came to Afghanistan, I came to study this, I found this topic in a sort of a very detached way, right? I approached Afghanistan from the perspective of global security, right? Why do we need to secure Afghanistan, right? That was the thing that kept bothering me, right? And being there, I found that my way of contributing to global security literature and global security studies was actually to say, we need to pull this whole focus down. The lens needs to be on these trivial conversations, on everyday people and how their bodies suffer or push back. And by finding the Afghan Body, I immediately found myself able to sort of skip a whole lot of the sort of bureaucratic sort of lingo, admin speak, sort of high political, high sounding, highbrow language of, like I said, largely empty strategic statements, and find the subject that actually has been affected by global stability.
Thank you, Bojan. I think from what you're saying about bodies and subjectivities, it returns me to the point that Gerard makes on the book, that the global war on terror's original target now has its Foucauldian portrait. Gerard, I wonder whether you might give us a sense of what the theoretical contribution you see in Bojan's book, and what it's making and how it's transforming our discourse on global security.
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to speak. I'm very happy to do so. And to engage with the school on this very, very important book and very important set of problematics that are now at a particular moment where the US is sort of letting go of them. That's been a long time coming. But it most explicitly now this year was really letting go of Afghanistan as something that needs to be secured. This is a theory book, and it is rich in so many ways. It is a searing critique of the idea of global governance and where the global comes from, who the global belongs to. And it's really a book that's misnamed. In reading it, I was thinking, you know, this book should be called something like Reading Foucault in Herat, or, you know, with des Surtout at the border. you know, on the lines of Georgi Dergulian's fantastic book, Bourdieu's Secret Admirer in the Caucasus. Theory is front and center here. And it's surprising to me because of the particular title, and I'm thinking, okay, this is an Afghanistan book, and then when you come into it, you really, the value of this book is how much it takes theory, discursive theory, certainly grounded in Foucault, but also way beyond Foucault. So there is C. Wright Mills is there. Wallerstein is addressed, Spivak, and post-colonial theory. There's Gramsci. There's a whole range of theoretical literature. Even the ideas, as you just heard him talking about, the idea of resistance through small gestures. So there's an anthropological consciousness there too. And so that I think is very valuable. And what does it do? Well, it provides this critique grounded in this theoretical literature, this critique of this object, global security. And then when he gets to Afghanistan, in ostensibly, and what he's just said has really kind of helped sort of flesh out the story of the book. Bojan has to do has to adopt a methodology which is on the fly and which is hard. And there's a sort of, the searing critique meets the ground, but there's still a kind of a fire and an anger really in the book about how this is unfolded. And so the theory actually is a set of lenses that he brings to Afghanistan. And so he finds things that others with less critical lenses will not find, they will just not appear on the landscape at all. So I think that brings us to the second kind of quality for me of the book. The first is how kind of theoretical it is and how it's engaging with a global, which then gets very, very local. The second quality is its spatiality and its distinctive spatiality. I'm a geographer. I was deeply disappointed, Bojan, that there's no map in the book. I was like, how could this be? That you could have a book which is really, it's about a place, about a particular city, and one of, I believe it's 32 provinces, but it's really about the city. But more than that, when you get into the case studies, particularly the last two, it's about a particular world UNESCO, or at least aspirationally UNESCO heritage site, the Mosala, and of homeless people within it and drug addicts. And then it's also about what we've just mentioned, this border site, Islam Kala. So this is a sort of a fine approach to Afghanistan. So he's constantly sort of deconstructing abstractions, and he uses the term floating signifier or empty signifier, which is of course from Mälksoo. But the point is that he's kind of breaking it down, and then he's giving us very, very specific encounters which have been generated by his on-the-fly methodology. And this brings me to the third quality for me of the book, is that it's got a tragic quality to it and a disturbing quality to it. First of all, in some of the stories he tells of those that are marginalized on the Mosala, the homeless and homelessness. And some of the themes are some of the particular discourse which is local in Herat about the homeless, which he provides us with. It sounds very common to the type of discourse we would find in Brussels or in Washington, D.C. amongst the sort of professional class or the middle class, general public sensibility. But then he also gives us these kind of insights into desperate people and people being extremely vulnerable. And so that is, I think, a real contribution of the book. But it also leads to another tragedy, which is, I think, one we should discuss. And that is that I think that Bojan has set out to do something that he can't do, or he was unable to do. So in trying to study homeless, well, going to actually the homeless, and yet that encounter is effectively blocked by so many different institutional concerns. Trying to study the everyday experiences of people crossing the border. Again, he runs up against not simply language, but this overriding security, protection, kind of cultural, religious sets of constraints. So there's a tragic quality to it from his own research perspective. And, you know, I think it would be useful to talk about that. You know, I do have some critiques of the book, but I think that perhaps we could have Bojan address some of these issues.
Thank you, Gerard. Bojan, come back here. No maps, a tragic text, also dealing with the impossible.
I thank you so much, Jared. I mean, your comments are extremely generous. I wish I could have named it Foucault and Herat. My editor didn't quite like most of my ideas, but that would have been that one would have been right on the money. I love it. No map in the book. I don't know. Okay, so I could not, and I say this in my methodology section, I could not show and really reproduce a lot of the photos I took because they just didn't meet publishers' quality, sort of the in terms of pixels and whatnot. And so none of them were eligible. And I want to write more about that, you know, how, you know, we do risky research and you don't get to use fancy equipment when you do that. And so sort of expectations and industry standards, I think maybe there's something to be said about rethinking them. Okay, and so when I was then thinking, but what can I show? I was thinking about maps, and this is something worth discussing. I didn't like the map. I didn't like the idea of showing a map without showing anything else, right? I did not want to privilege the map in and of itself without being able to show all this other content, right? So the specific places, the tangibility of space as far as the photo can capture. I don't know why. I mean, it's such a good question. You know, I just remember thinking, well, if I can't show all these things that I captured with my eyes, you know, these maps, they're imperial productions in themselves. You know, they have a certain worldview, they have a certain point of view. These Cartesian sort of 2x2, you know, projections of Afghanistan. This is what I'm kind of railing against, you know, partially, and I just didn't like that absence of quote unquote underground Afghanistan and the presence of maps. But it's still not a good reason, you know, for not having them in there. So I don't know entirely why they're not there, but that was part of my own resistance to it. I don't know if this is a good answer, but it's an honest one. Now, the tragic quality of the book, I could not agree more. I felt like as I was doing field work, and then I did a first round of field work in 2014, 2015. Then I went back then North Carolina, and then a second round of field work from Brussels. I as much as I was excited about what I was learning, the kind of data I was collecting, I was continuously frustrated about what I could not do. And I don't know if I was purposefully trying to get that across or it just comes across anyways. I think perhaps both. But a sense of a border really around my own body, and I talk about that a little, around the risk that enveloped me and my informants and my sort of gatekeepers and guides. It was inescapable, right? It followed me everywhere, right? The sort of being confronted with the homeless and being a little heartbroken, and yet not being able to talk to them. The very fact that I now talk about them rather than as someone distinct from me as a researcher, rather than people who I've interviewed, right, who are present, whose voices are present in my book, that is very frustrating, right? But again, I was told you can't do it for a whole lot of reasons. There was a sort of institutional risk assessment that prevented me from doing things against the advice of my guides, of my informants, of my interpreters. And it was an endless sort of sense of frustration. And you capture it beautifully when you talk about my own limitations of sort of maneuvering and walking and being around the border. And as much as I saw, there's as much or probably more that just remained sort of inaccessible to me. But I think that's important to get across. I think that I acknowledged in the book that I am part of the privileged world class who's gazing at Afghanistan with a lot of interest, right? With a lot of sort of some scholarly fascination. And I think it is important to show where I, as part of that global apparatus, where I cannot go, because it shows that the space of everyday life in pushes back against not just global institutions, but someone like myself as well. And as much as those limitations made me miserable, they were also exciting. Right? That it is exciting to be reminded of my privileged position. Right? It is exciting to be shown my place, really, and to be reminded that all of the analytical tools that I have at my disposal, they're to a large extent inadequate or only get you so far, right? Now, what you make out of that, do you go back? Do you change your direction in research? I still need to grapple with that question. But for now, yes, I'm in a way frustrated by the boundaries, but also excited that they were there, that the reader can, in fact, see them because they're important. And at the end, I think that I hope that addresses most of your questions as far as I could sort of write them down. But thank you, very, very useful.
Thank you. I just want to bring in one question, but just to remind everybody, if you want to ask questions, please do put them in the chat. And then we're going to flip the process a little bit. And I'm going to ask Bojan to give a few questions to Maximilian and Gerard. But let's first of all ask you this question from Albana. In celebration of your book, she'd like to ask, what was the most funny or the most happy incident during the pregnancy, the birth of the book?
Yes, because there are actual episodes of pregnancies in the book. So I was, well, the funniest things happened, talking to people. The way they were making fun of security guards, really, the way they talked about sort of quote unquote milking the cow, and just the humor that my interviewees used sort of to talk about how they survive global security, really, how they cope with it on a daily basis. I mean, people are funny, to be honest. There were lots of jokes, and that was one of the endlessly sort of enjoyable aspects of research. And also, it is just so amazing to laugh at things that don't translate well into English, that are kind of crooked, a little quirky, that, to find humor in things that you don't normally even think about because your space and your context are very different, right? It was interesting to listen to jokes that in the quote unquote West, we would think of as off color or not really politically correct, and just listening to those jokes that were being shared with a lot of gusto, it put me on the spot and sort of, do you laugh against sometimes your own beliefs, or do you not laugh and therefore cause and arise some suspicion on the part of your interviewees and your audiences. But yeah, something as it often happens, you know, some of the funniest things were pretty, you know, we're not for wider audiences, but I do talk about them in the book. I'm a little bit shy about telling those jokes now, but they're in the book. So do feel free to look for them.
Thanks, Bojan. Really good to sort of hear that. So what I would like to invite Bojan now, it's a text of intersections in many ways, and one of the intersections is the intersection to Maximilian and Gerard's own work. So Bojan, how do you want to kind of look at those intersections?
Yes, thank you, Jeremy. So I slightly wanted to flip the script and talk a little bit myself with the panelists. So if I could first turn to Max, I just wanted to draw some parallels between what you did in your book, Afghanistan and the Coloniality of Diplomacy, and what I did in my book. And in a way, I want to move the conversation slightly away from sort of the object, the book itself, to Afghanistan, because that was the point of the book, right? So let's talk a little bit about Afghanistan, but still about our research agendas. What I thought was very interesting in one of your articles that I was reading before your book came out was also your focus on the body. Your focus on space, and in particular on colonial and imperial architecture, right? The focus on the British legation in Kabul, or the proto-embassy, if you will. And I was just fascinated with the extent to which you managed to distill out the corporeality, right? The very bodily and very tangible quality of colonial texts on something that is decades removed from you now, from your own research now, and from my research. I was impressed with that level of detail. I mean, to me, it was the best of anthropological tradition in historiography. So can you tell us a little bit about why you were interested in this particular take on history, right? I find these parallels. You talk a lot about the compound of delegation, right? I was fascinated with this idea that I was expected to live on a compound when I was in Afghanistan. You know, what kind of compound? I don't have that kind of money. I don't have that kind of protection. That's not my story. I live, you know, in a room someone's renting. But the fascination with the compound is there through colonial and post-colonial times. So can you talk a little bit about that focus?
Very gladly, you know, right back at you. Thank you very much for these kind words. If I don't know, I'm wondering if I should follow up on what Jared said earlier. May I, or shall we continue that conversation later? But I think I'm just going to pick up the thread from there. I take a slightly more optimistic, or should I say less pessimistic view about your book. And perhaps that's also partly playing devil's advocate so that we have a balance across the panel. I think Jared raises really, really important points. What I really liked about your book, before I come to the question that you raised, what I liked about your book is that there is a deep reflection on your part as a researcher about your discipline. There's a sense of disillusionment with the discipline. The fact that that discipline does not do justice to, let's say, the reality as it is perceived. And I think that's also one of the insightful aspects of this book. So I think, yes, you can call it a tragedy that in a way the book doesn't go anywhere, but that's in a way the point of your book. It's that liminality, this idea of introducing certain assumptions and certain objectives and goals on a subject, and then measuring them out, and in a way that has failure written into the metric in the first place. So yes, you can call it a tragedy, but in a way, the way you go about it, for me, that is a predicament that I think that we all share as post-colonial researchers. The one step that we have to take, and I think you're doing this in this book, where you engage with the inheritances of this knowledge and of the disciplines, that we at least become aware of them and do a little bit on our part to critically push them forward and open up the seams and think outside of those boxes. And I think I totally share Jared's point of view that, you know, there is a liminality, but in many ways, perhaps I would rephrase it as the post-colonial predicament, that like decolonization itself, that process may not ever be a complete one. It may not ever actually get us somewhere. And in many ways, and you know, I hope I'm finding the right words here, just to begin that journey of critically engaging with our own scholarship, with our own assumptions, is perhaps just the first step that you've undertaken here. So that is just what I thought about the discussion. It's really interesting, and it's an important one because we share all of that. We share that by being critical researchers. And in many ways, that is what brought me into my own subject. I come out of diplomatic history in a way. The way diplomatic history was being taught in the German educational system, it is this elevated, top-down, very, very super elitist kind of writing of history that is deeply connected with the state. And the way I launched into an interest into bodily history was through the history of India, through the history of medicine, David Arnold's work on the colonizing body, and then Elizabeth Collingham, imperial body. So there's a vast scholarship in the colonial context on the body and what the body does, how it is a contact zone, how it is also a place upon which power is exerted. And I think once you have that lens on, once you wear those glasses, the experience is similar to perhaps yours when you did your field research. It just jumps out at you in the very different registers of bodily comportment, of how bodies should look like, of how they should act normally according to colonial notions of responsibility, statehood. Are these Afghan bodies actually able to conduct international relations? Are they ready? So in my work, when I started reconsidering Anglo-Afghan relations in the interwar period, as it is called, which is of course a problematic term in itself, it just jumps out at you to the degree to which Afghan bodies are assessed, scrutinized, gazed at, labeled, and always labeled with difference, and always othered, and always subjected. And from that process of othering always comes the assumption of European supremacy, which in itself erodes the idea of diplomatic equality, which is, you know, the story in my book. It's also one of asymmetries that come out of these constructions of knowledge of how Afghan bodies are somehow different in all sorts of ways. And it's not a long step from there to then recognize the superiority or the self-claimed superiority of Western bodies that need protecting from this violent geography, from dirty bodies, from unhygienic climates and surroundings in Kabul itself, to building a compound that really securitizes the European body and thereby reestablishes colonial notions of hierarchy. Because the book that I wrote is essentially the history of a diplomatic mission in Kabul, which is the precursor to the later British embassy. And I look at that compound and how that compound was organized. And you just look at the map of the compound and you see the racial organization, who lives next to the stables, who actually gets to live in the offices and work in the offices, who is not allowed in, who guards the gates. And suddenly you have really this microcosm of colonialism in which Afghans are day laborers and Indians are security staff, take care of the horses and the animals, but where there's an Anglo-Indian middle elite that actually does most of the office work. And then you've got the colonial officers who in a way are the diplomats. So you've got, this is how I went about looking at the delegation. I, in a way, did my own bit of inverting the inheritances that we usually face with. And I turned the focus on diplomacy as a tool itself, and something that we don't often do, that we turn the gaze back, if you want, at the colonizer and at the power or at the source of power. Does that answer your question?
Oh yeah.
Yes, definitely. And thank you so much for that, because what I was really fascinated by reading your work is how, you know, traveling decades back to, you know, the early 20th, mid 20th century, you found discourses of the Afghan body that I was reading about as modern, right? that were supposedly, that all were predicated on this break. This is all post-2001. This is a new description of Afghanistan. This is the new stuff we're going to do there. And I was fascinated with the parallels that emerged, you know, when I was reading your work. It was like, well, yes, I've been reading this sort of British imperial literature and Russian literature on Herat, on Pashtuns, and it's all very sort of, yes, there's a sort of attitude of colonial arrogance and entitlement to description, to judgment, entitlement to disciplining, right? But then reading contemporary discourses as well, I saw these parallels, and then I found your work, and it's like, okay, there's a middle point there that for me reaffirms that there's something broader going on, right? That there's a mannerism, that there's a reflex, that there's a habit, that there's a congealed practice of how you say Afghanistan when you say Afghanistan, how you inflect it. That's what I found fascinating, right? And this goes back actually to Jared's point also on how a lot of these treatments of the Afghan body actually resonate with how, you know, people are treated at the borders, you know, closer to the West, you know, how the homeless are treated over in Brussels or in DC. And so to me, because as Enlightenment, you know, as people of Enlightenment, academics, Westerners, right, we're taught to think this says something about the universality of human nature, right? The human spirit across ages and spaces. No, to me, this said something about the replicability, the iterability, the repetition in the operation of post-colonial power, right? To me, that said something about the habits of power, more so than the universal human nature. I don't know if that thing exists, but what I try to argue, what does exist is the way that humans are subjected based on class, racial, gender, sexual grounds, and that these subjections are used in order to prop up certain regimes of power. That's the parallel I found, and that's why I was so attracted to your work. So thank you for doing it. Thank you for writing it. All right, now I'd like to ask Jared a question as well. And by the way, Jared, I think we could talk forever about how critical geopolitics and really my rereading of Foucault when I did work with you have shaped how I see space as produced through politics and space that conditions politics. I think we can talk forever about how critical geopolitics has got me to a place where I see race, class, gender in spatial terms. But, and so all of that is fascinating, but what I did really wanted to talk to you about and to ask you about is your focus on what you call thick geopolitical analysis, right? And something that I found in your work over the years. In Bosnia Remade, you did ethnographic research in 3 cities in Bosnia, right? Then and so that came out in 2011, if I'm not mistaken. Then in Near Abroad, which came out in 2017, you talk about ethnographic attitude and how you approach the conduct of Russian, of American, of Georgian, of Ukrainian foreign policy, right? And then now, you know, fast forward to 2019, and currently you're using survey methods to explore the geopolitical orientations of everyday, again, ordinary people in post-Soviet spaces. Can you tell me a little bit about why thick geopolitics is important? And what does it really mean in both terms of academia, but also for policy and the conduct of foreign policy?
You asked the easiest questions at the end. And that issue can be answered in 2 ways. It can be answered within the context of practical policy making. Why is thick geopolitics important? It's important because it is much more informed research on places. You would be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't be surprised given the last few years observing US foreign policy, but the degree to which political discourse runs on sort of empty signifiers and on scripts which are already there, and people who are simply looking to affirm that which they already believe and then slot in particular country, slot in your ideas about terrorists and so on and so forth. Where are the bad guys? Where do we need to go and kill them, and so on and so forth? And then how do we understand Afghanistan? You know, and that's partly what your book is seeking to really challenge. Well, think geopolitics is about getting way beyond those particular convenient constructions of our own culture and the immediacy of our own culture. It's the world that we create, but it's a parochial world, and it is often a world that doesn't have direct contact with the ground, with so that it can be disturbed, it can be dislocated. Another kind of concept from Mälksoo, where the real meets the symbolic order and the real fails, or the real punctures the symbolic order. COVID is a great example. Climate change is another great example. It's this particular moment. Well, critical geopolitics gives us a sense, gives us a challenge to find a symbolic order, to find sets of understandings which go way beyond the everyday scripts that we use to understand places. So that's, you know, in practical terms, why it's important. In critical academic terms, it is important because there is so much we just don't know. There are so many things that where we have to challenge ourselves, and we have to challenge how we know about what we think we know. And so it's part, I see it as part of this kind of process of constantly questioning our own subjectivity. And, you know, this is a sort of has a reflexive quality to it, is that, well, is critical geopolitics critical enough, or, you know, what are its own weaknesses? And post-colonial theory itself, what are its impossibilities? And for me, that doesn't mean throwing out maps as forever these kind of toxic Cartesian view from above. You know, they can also be useful. They can also help situate, and we have to tell stories. And we sort of, Spivak talks about a power which we cannot not want. We are caught in being authorities of sorts, and that we can use that position of privilege to try to write counter stories to hegemonic stories. And I think that's what you're doing in this book. That's what I would like to think I'm trying to do also. But I see that as having a certain value within the policy world too.
Absolutely, thank you. Thank you so much. That's kind of what I was hoping to get from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerard. We've got a lot of questions that are also coming in, and so I'll come back to Maximilian and Gerard in a while. But you've been talking, Bojan, of gendered and sexual bodies and the multiple bodies in your work. We have an insightful question here about Afghan women and women's rights, and in the name of Afghan women's rights. So the question here is: could you provide an example from your fieldwork of a moment where you were confronted with the discrepancy between what the women you met needed and what Afghan women are told they need?
Thank you. I saw that question from Emanuela, who was my PhD classmate back in the day. So thank you so much for that. Yes, this was such an important dynamic, because what I've read in sort of these manuals and instructions for women's rights, and this comes from the UN, a cadre of institutions, agencies, programs, but also from NGOs on quote unquote the ground, right? What they say is that women need empowerment, and so they're told that they need to be empowered, right? And then this is somehow coupled with the phrase of, oh, they need a seat at the table, right? But then in reality, when you sort of start breaking that down to see what it really means, is that they're being told that they should be less compliant, less obedient, that they should be themselves somehow more assertive, more courageous, that they should run for office, that they should apply for jobs, and they should start businesses. And here's how you start a business. Here's how you join a political campaign, right? They weren't being given absolutely any resource, or they weren't being allowed to find resources. They were being told that they need to look for them. They were being told that they need to change how they go about their daily lives in order to be empowered, right? They are being told, oh, you need to be empowered, right? But in fact, global governance institutions and the Afghan government provided them with little to nothing to actually make empowerment sort of a more of a lived reality. And these bad, you know, as Spivak again says, that, you know, we're in Afghanistan, and across the world we are defending brown women from brown men, right? These women are told how, you know, the predicate of their vulnerability is the bad men around them, who abuse them, who do bad things to them. But insofar I was able to talk to some, you know, informants who identified as women, it was a very different set of challenges, right? Sure, all sorts of violence were there, but when they talked about violence, they were mostly focused on how, you know, guys that are in charge of security in Herat are in bed with the Taliban, are in bed with Iranian security services, are in bed with Pakistani. They don't feel that there is a basic sort of experience, that there's a basic provision of safety from those who claim that they have the right to do that. And then, yes, there are other layers of vulnerability, but the way they talk, and especially two women that I interviewed who work on domestic violence, they squarely embedded the sort of discourse of domestic violence, which is something that the Western feminists, liberal feminists love to focus on, because here's the Afghan victim that we will save, right? The way they embedded domestic violence is actually in broader societal violence that is reproduced through night raids, drone attacks, violent governmental structures, violent police and military officers who are all empowered, who are all put in place to quote unquote do security, yet they were the mechanic, they were the apparatus of vulnerability for these women. And a lot of things that I was being told about how I should or should not talk to women during fieldwork, again, I had to abide by a lot of, you know, that counsel and advice. But what I also saw in practice is that, you know, these religious divides that are supposedly so prevalent are you know, largely manufactured. And yes, you can strike up a conversation with whoever you like when you're waiting, you know, to withdraw money from a local, from a neighborhood ATM, right? You don't need to reinforce this supposed gender binary, right? Obviously, you will be respectful to people, but the Afghan woman as constructed is not this inaccessible passive object that we need to save. She's alive, right? They are alive. They talk to people who will listen. Problem is how we think we should be talking to ordinary Afghan women, right? Through these filters of rule of law, gender rights, liberal feminism, and a lot of it is useless, to be honest.
Thank you, Bojan. And Maximilian and Gerard, do you want to come back on any of this reflection of the place within Afghan society of women and how that informs the security debate? Anyone want to come back on that point? Because I think that one of the interesting things, of course, about Foucault is in his own analysis is the gender blind construction, and also his inability to really kind of frame the race, critical race discourse fundamentally, and whether this aspect of gender, sexuality needs to be strengthened in any engagement with his own work.
So just two points. One, and this comes from Bojan's book, the sort of women and girls discourse is part of the rationale. It's a sort of a savior rationale, it's a protection rationale for the intervention. And it is very powerful, and it recruits certain constituencies for what others would see as a violent imperial intervention in Afghanistan. So it recruits feminists in the West. So that's point number one. And therefore it can be seen as a form of thin geopolitics, because what we understand as feminist rights and women empowerment may not translate at all onto the ground in Afghanistan. And so therefore that's the thin versus thick. But the second point is that I would be less, I guess, condemnatory about the capacity of feminism, mostly Western feminism, to understand and to grapple with the diversity of Afghanistan. I mean, there are Western Afghanistan feminist organizations, and they, you know, will have their own particular politics of who's privileged and whatnot. But, you know, and it may be very imperfect, but it is a start. It is a opening up of a space to discuss those sets of issues. And having that space open, I think, creates possibilities, creates a security apparatus which can be, maybe to some just on the margins, but less violent, and can be much more attentive to the types of things that it needs to be attentive to. So in that sense, I am not someone who, I would want us to acknowledge the complexity of the issue, and I'd want to study it in greater detail.
Thank you, Gerard. Maximilian, do you want to come in on that?
Yes, please. I'm very mindful of my own positionality. What we've discussed earlier as well. But I think I want to echo what Gerard and Bojan have said here, regardless of that. If we bring it back to the early 20th century, ever since the 1920s, for instance, the role of women in Afghan society was deeply connected to how the state should administer female sexuality. So, for instance, there's the story of the Queen of Afghanistan who tore off her veil as a sort of act of liberation, which was looked upon as Afghanistan's launching into the modern world. So the female body, the female Afghan body, was deeply connected with a sense of modern Afghan statehood, and with that sort of temporality coming out of a dark age, in inverted commas, and launching into the realm of international relations at a time when Afghanistan was modernizing, was presenting itself as a state on the world stage also. The female body has been sort of predicated, or the sexuality of Afghan women has been predicated and deeply entangled with those notions of modernity, of progress. And I think this is where the problem of positionality comes in, not only between men and women, but also between Western feminisms and Afghan feminisms. The Western feminism, and I think this is what Gerard hinted at as well, is already sort of constrained by its own assumptions about what liberation of the female body is. And so the question really that was posed here is an important one, and really reminds us of the fact that we need to be open, as Gerard said, to critiquing and to testing the ground on which we actually stand. More exploration is needed and more voices need to be given.
Thank you, Maximilian. I've taken Chair's privilege of allowing us to go over our hour, because there is so much that we've got into and so much still to explore. So I'm going to bring in another question from Lucy, who says that her own connection to Afghanistan is through young people who are facing forced return there from the UK. They describe Afghanistan as a strange and dangerous place. Bojan, she says, do you have any insights into how their bodies might be interpreted? How might they develop recognizable identities as Afghan adults? Bojan.
Thank you. That's such a strong question and so important. I think my immediate experience with the returning into Afghanistan was at this border crossing, right, where I physically saw, scores of mostly Afghan men of all ages, sort of, and you could try and maybe guess of different socioeconomic statuses and class belongings, sort of crossing the border back into Afghanistan, right, and sort of being, repatriated or voluntarily returning or just forcibly kicked out of Iran. And a lot of them were coming from, farther out, not from Iran, but they were sort of being returned to Afghanistan through Iran. And so that particular body, I had the privilege to observe and then talk to some people at the border about people who returned and what their future is, who they are, what their role in resisting post-colonial power, but also replicating its operation, what their role is. And it was very, very hard to grasp or describe or homogenize that returnee, right? Their body language was hard to summarize, and maybe say, oh, there are 2 or 3 types of behaviors that I could see. No, class belonging, all of it was very, very diverse. I don't think there's one story here. I think that people who are returned to Afghanistan are acutely aware of how hard it is to leave it again. And so I think when people talk about it as dangerous, as threatening, at least what my interviews have shown, is that they're at least partially getting at this impossibility of negotiating the borders of it. Because in a way, they're confined to this place. They're shoved into it, quite literally. And then we expect them to think of Afghanistan as a space of freedom. Well, it can be that. Right? When constricted, when contained, when repeatedly made to listen that you are a threat to global peace, which to all these people sounds ridiculous, by the way. And if this is the repeated talk about you, it is very difficult. And that you can't just leave. Even rich Afghans can't just pack up and go to Dubai as much as they love to, or to Iran, or to China, right? It's extremely difficult to leave the country as a tourist, let alone as, and a longer term immigrant. And so what I've seen is that all these people who are made to go back, more than anything, they just have to contend with the lid that's been put on the space to which they're said they have to belong. Regardless of who they are, in terms of their class, in terms of their tribal, ethnic belonging, educational levels, they're racialized first and then everything else comes afterwards. That was my experience of the Afghan returnee, and then later on through some of the conversations.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Maximilian and Gerard to come back with some final framings and questions for Bojan. But while they think about that final question, I wonder whether I can just focus just for a moment on your use of Foucault. When everybody says they do a Foucauldian study, I'm always asking myself, which Foucault are we talking about? And I wonder whether you're responding to the kind of moment in Foucault studies when the Collège de France lectures really transformed the way we read Foucault, and from the 1975 lectures, that central period of Foucault studies of the mid-70s is the one that drives your analysis, with some aspects of later subjectivity. But I wondered whether you were mindful of that kind of moment when political theory, and I'm thinking of Michael Dillon and Andrew Neil's study, which picked up those early and late 70s lectures and transformed the way that political theory engages with notions of security and territory and sovereignty. Is that the Foucault that you privileged? And what, as Michael Dillon and Andrew Neil say, is what's the fallibility? What's the weakness of using that bit of Foucault?
Thank you. This sort of question tugs at my heartstrings, as you know. The use of, Jared is right to say that this is a very theoretical book in many ways. I drew so much inspiration from the people I talked to, but the ways I was listening to them were in many ways set, 10, 15 years ago. What I was predisposed to hear was obviously shaped through what I was reading. The Foucault that I read first as an undergrad in Belgrade, where, by the way, this sort of German, French, continental approach to anything is you need to read everything around it, right? So I was trained as a diplomat, which was so, to me, was so funny when I was reading Maximilian's work as well. I was trained to be a diplomat, but to be a diplomat, I had to read, French post-structuralists as well. Go figure. But that was a Foucault before sort of the more recent translations, right? Such as security, territory, population. So when I was completing my PhD, I was still in Brussels, and just as I moved to Washington D.C., where I worked with Jared for a while, I was reading this different Foucault, and I was tremendously helped in connecting the dots by the work of Stuart Eldon, another critical geographer, and Chris Philo, who yet another one, who did such a good job at showing us that the way that Foucault has been translated over time, the way that he's been made available to wider and academic audiences, there are lots of disruptions. So don't do this crazy stuff of trying to recover a grand Foucault, right? The one approach, the one message he tries to get across. There is no such thing, but also pointing at certain continuities, right? Pointing at certain methodological replications, reinventions, transformations, right? And so it was exciting. I think it was part of the reason why I, in many ways, returned to a Foucauldian framework of thought, is because it was alive, right? It was being brought to me just as I was getting a little saturated with sort of traditional security studies and mainstream international relations, right? They were really the name of the game as far as my PhD went. And even though Foucault is not the best at talking about the formerly colonized colonial, post-colonial spaces, he's sort of blind when it comes to post-coloniality. The language, the tools that he's provided in combination with post-colonial theory, they excited me a lot. Honestly, it was such a joy to be reading the most recent texts published, right? And the commentaries that came from post-colonial studies on the recent Foucault, and then going to the field. Right? That was such an exciting process, right? So in a way, this book captures everything on the fly: theory on the fly, method on the fly, sociological focus on the fly. I'm surprised I managed to pull off anything semi-coherent, because as I was writing, I was living this difficulty of capturing into finite words something that was very much in flux.
Right. Thank you, Bojan, and also Michel Foucault on the fly. They're delivering these lectures in the Collège de France. I'm going to jump to Gerard first in case he wants to pick up on this, the selective nature of use of Foucault, and any final comment that you want to bring to Bojan, and then I'm going to bring in Maximilian. Gerard.
So I guess what I would say in final thoughts would be something to the students that are listening, and that is that you know, this book here, which I would recommend that you purchase or get from a good library, it's a brave book because he goes into a field that is dangerous. It's also a working through of his own subjectivity, and the question of subjectivity is at its heart. And what I would say to the students that are out there is that your own particular subjectivity is an asset for you. What you have to do as a researcher is critically reflect on that particular positionality and what that provides you with, and what that allows you to see, but also work on the particular privileges or blind spots that may come with that, the sort of the gendered assumptions, the racial assumptions, and the like. And you will do better social science if you sort of reflect in that way. And then I would say you don't have to be as brave as Bojan to go off into a location like contemporary Afghanistan. There are lots of different locations where you can bring to bear your particular research, and I hope that the students do that.
Thank you, Gerard. Maximilian.
Yes, thank you. No, I want to echo what Gerard has said. I think this is a journey, and I think you know, engaging with a new subject in such a way as Bojan has done, and as he's shown to us here today, this is an exciting, but also an exciting journey. But it's also a journey that marks you in a good way, if also in a problematic way, in a liminal way. Perhaps it doesn't go; it goes somewhere else completely. But such is, I think, the nature of learning and studying anyway. So I would also echo what Gerard said about engaging with the book, reading it, and making up your own mind about it, and taking away some of that critical methodology that Bojan has introduced us to. I think that the questions are also great. So I want to thank those who've been listening and putting in questions. And to be honest with you, I don't have an answer to the question that was posed here in the forum. It sort of made me think about the larger realm of violence to which Afghanistan has been subjected. And this is not a story that just begins in 2001. There is a superpower conflict that took place in the 1980s, which obviously has also contributed to Afghans have been forced into the world, as it were. There's a global diaspora of Afghans. And I think the story that we hear from Lucy in the question and answer section is one I think that is widely shared. And in many ways, the answers are for people who have been displaced or who come from families who have been displaced. The answers are for them to find. That is, in a way, to come back to this notion of tragedy. But I would also take heart in the fact that there are stories about these experiences now out there, and there are ways to think about identities that are actually empowering. And Bojan does this in his book as well, to sort of rewrite and write back at powerful discourses. And in that way, I think the big question that I took away from the book: where do we go from here? What does this story of the postcolonial border in Herat, what does it tell us about similar post-colonial spaces? What does it tell us about similar post-colonial spaces in Afghanistan itself that has also always been constructed as this holistic idea, which it is not, or it is that in a fragile way? But also, what does it tell us about the people who cross these borders? And what does it tell us about maybe a global experience of border crossing? And essentially, what does it tell us about the regimes of borders that we face? And perhaps in the West, we, in inverted commas, are used to crossing quite easily and unproblematically. So in that way, that book goes well beyond its subject matter and raising questions, not just about yourselves as students and writers, or about ourselves as academics. It raises questions about the subject matter itself, but also to think broader about perhaps the post-colonial modern experience that we all share. Yes, I suppose one question that I had, if I were to put it forward, was what happens to Herati resistance when the occupation ends? What happens to that fuel to many lives when that oppression ends? That was, in a way, one of the intriguing questions that I well, that was very present on my mind when I closed the book.
Thank you, Maximilian. I'm just also going to hold us up just to celebrate Bojan's great achievement, Afghanistan Under Siege, the Afghan Body and the Postcolonial Border. And the tribute that I want to make to this book is that Michel Foucault, in that part of the world, in Iran in 1979, wrote a little essay called Is It Useless to Revolt? And one of the intriguing points that he made in that text was he said that what we needed to do was look behind politics for that which ought to limit it. And if you've achieved exactly that, I would like to say you have, in following Foucault, to look behind politics to find what limits it. And this is a tremendous achievement, and congratulations on it. And I'm going to leave the final word to Bojan on the achievement of his book.
Thank you, Jeremy, so much for your kind words, for moderating the event. Thank you, Jared and Maximilian, so much for joining the panel. I do want to say, this was such an important question, where do we go from here? I concluded the book by saying the parameters of Afghan governance, or of the governing of Afghanistan, right? The government of Afghanistan, parameters have been set in place, right? Containment, and then, depending on levels of troops or money, but some type of incentivization of good life at the expense of bad practices, bad people. But containment and putting a lid on the country is the first tool of global management of Afghanistan. And as aid levels have dropped down, as a lot of troops have been pulled out, although as former Obama staffers have recently pointed out, we actually don't really know the exact, correct, and specific figures of sort of numbers of U.S. troops in Afghanistan. We haven't known that reliably in a transparent way since December 2017. So there's a lot to be said about, how do people keep seeing all these, Americans on the ground if there's only 8,000 of them, right? Without sort of sliding into conspiracy theories, all I want to say is we don't really have transparent access to this kind of data. But more importantly, parameters have been put in place, and power will not disappear, right? This or that warlord, power broker, as they're called, may be killed, may be arrested. Another one may come into their place. We may have 2,000 or 7,000 U.S. troops in the country. Afghanistan may stop being a strategic partner to the U.S. These modalities may change, but the broad parameters are there, and they're not going to go away. What I'm really concerned about is where sort of the critical analyst will go, where sort of the critical scholar will go with this reshaping of how power works upon Afghanistan, right? As things seem to stabilize, quote unquote, right? As Afghanistan slowly disappears from sort of the headlines of the global media, will critical scholarship also lose its interest, right? People like us, right? Well, they say, well, this is not that much of a sexy place anymore. And it seems like there's been a coda to this story. We've learned what we've learned. It kind of repeats itself. Let's go somewhere else. Right. And so that to me is the real question, right? Us as critical or activist scholars, we have our own part to play in Afghan resistances. We shouldn't be claiming to be with the people. That is, to be honest, very arrogant. But we are with critical analysis, and that's what we can keep doing. And I'll try to figure out a way I can keep doing that.
Great, thank you, Bojan. Can I thank Bojan for creating this moment of engagement? I think we could have gone on much longer, but time is not on our side. Can I thank Maximilian Drafal and Gerard Toll and all of you for joining us. It's been a great discussion, and the book will keep on provoking lots of questions for students, and in terms of that constant critical engagement with security and governance. Thank you all very much and have a good evening.
Thank you.